Hi, so in this video I'm going to continue my series on Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. And so in the last video I started by looking at the chapter 1 of this book where Kant develops his theory of the good will. And what he basically argues is that moral virtues in themselves do not contain any moral value. Their moral value rather comes from the intention behind their utilization, and that intention is expressed through the concept of the goodwill. And Kant thinks you can only really develop a goodwill if it is governed by the use of reason, by the rational ability. Now, I kind of explained how in Kant's thinking what this entails is that one essentially makes decisions on the basis of principles as opposed to the immediate outcome of a situation, the immediate result of a situation, and that often when one acts ethically, one will not necessarily be happy at that time because it does involve a kind of negation of one's immediate inclinations to do such and such, and involves a kind of putting into practice a set of rationally governed moral principles. So I want to look at Kant's text now, where he actually goes into detail to explain what he means by rationally governed moral principles. Because what that means in Kant has a very specific meaning. So I want to start by reading here. So this is in the middle of chapter 1, after he introduces the notion of duty. Kant says, "I will here pass over all actions already recognized as contrary to duty, however useful they may be with a view to this or that end." So actions that might be useful for some particular end or goal, but do not correspond to duty. We might say in some cases it might seem more beneficial to lie, but Kant would say, it may be beneficial, it nonetheless goes contrary to duty. And his argument would be, therefore, we shouldn't do it. But what does that mean? So he's going to ignore all those things. He's going to say, for about these, the question does not even arise whether they could have been done for the sake of duty, inasmuch as they are directly opposed to it. So lying, for example, Kant would say, you should never lie under any circumstances. It couldn't have been done for the sake of duty. So he's going to put that aside. He's also going to put aside actions which in effect accord with duty, yet for which men have no immediate inclination but perform them because impelled to do so by some other inclination. For there it is easy to decide whether the action which accords with the duty has been done from duty or from some purpose of self-interest. So, for example, what Kant means here is these are like actions where one could rationally ground the action. For example, looking after one's fellow human being by volunteering in a COVID clinic that's understaffed. The clinic's understaffed and you go volunteer because you want to help your fellow human being and you think this will contribute to the COVID response and address the healthcare worker shortage. And okay, such an action is good. Kant says that action could be rationally grounded, but you didn't necessarily do it out of a purely rational decision. You did it from a pragmatic, utilitarian decision with a view to the outcome. And there's nothing wrong with that in Kant's thinking necessarily. Of course, it's perfectly fine to do that. But what would it mean to volunteer for different motives, for different reasons, That's what Kant wants to look at. He's going to put that aside, however, these kinds of actions, like the one I gave, because whether one acted rationally or out of self-interest in the COVID response situation example, it's hard. It might be hard to distinguish. I could tell myself that the reason I did it is because in every situation where people are in need, I jump to the scene and help them. That might be my principle, but it could be that maybe subconsciously I had other motives. Maybe I wanted to look good for my family, or I wanted to simply have contact with people because I was lonely. That Kant wants to avoid that. He makes a kind of abstraction in order to analyze this at a more detailed level. So he says, this distinction is far more difficult to perceive when action accords with duty and the subject has in addition an immediate inclination to the action, like the one I just gave. For example, it is certainly accords with duty that a grocer should not overcharge his inexperienced customer. And where there is much competition, a sensible shopkeeper refrains from doing so and keeps to a fixed and general price for everybody, so that a child can buy from him just as well as anyone else. So what he's saying here is a shop owner doesn't engage in price gouging to take advantage of people, basically, in a desperate situation. During the COVID crisis, there were many places where there were shortages of food and things like this. Kant would say the shopkeeper shouldn't engage in a kind of price gouging. He says, thus people are served honestly, but this is the important point. This has not enough to justify us in believing that the shopkeeper has acted in this way from duty or from principles of fair dealing. His interest required him to do so. Right? A shopkeeper probably that doesn't engage in price gouging, doesn't want to get to pay a penalty from the state, a fine. They don't want to look bad in the eyes of the business community, small businesses that they're around. They don't want to get shut down. Self-interest is what governs them. So Kant would say they may justify their business honesty by saying, I always act honestly, irrespective of the situation. But Kant says it's hard to tell because self-interest is what's causing them to act this way. He says, we cannot assume him to have, in addition, an immediate inclination towards his customers, leading him, as it were, out of love, to give no man preference over another in the matter of price. Thus the action was done neither from duty nor from immediate inclination, but solely from purposes of self-interest. So all Kant here is saying is that example is hard to analyze at a philosophical level because there's it's kind of like in science in some ways. I guess if you're doing an experiment, you want to try to eliminate as many secondary factors that could contribute to a certain outcome in the experiment. Like if you're doing social research, you don't want to bias people towards a certain answer. That's exactly what Kant wants to do. He says it's a kind of difficult to analyze. It could bias us in a certain way. Okay, so he says, on the other hand, to preserve one's life is a duty. And besides this, everyone has also an immediate inclination to do so. But on account of this, the often anxious precaution taken by the greater part of mankind for this purpose have no inner worth, and the maxim of their action is without moral content. They do protect their lives in conformity with duty, but not from the motive of duty. When, on the contrary, disappointments and hopeless misery have taken away the taste for life, when a wretched man, strong in soul and more angered at his fate than faint-hearted or cast down, longs for death and still preserves his life without loving it, not from inclination or fear, but from duty, then indeed his maxim is a moral content. So the example Kant's given here is what he wants to analyze. He says most of us preserve our life not solely because we have the principle that we should always preserve our life. So many of us, maybe we're afraid of dying, so and he's talking here in like difficult situations. So, maybe you lose your job, divorce in your family, or so loved one dies, difficulties of life, something happens. Kant says it's in that situation that you can really judge whether someone acted out of duty or not. Now, if someone preserves one's life in that situation solely because they're afraid of dying, Kant says their action has no moral worth. But if they earnestly want to die, they don't want to live anymore, but they still preserve their life and think, maybe there is something I can contribute to this world, and I can't really know what that is. I also can't know why I'm in this situation. It's hard to say why all this is happening to me. Why me? Why are all these horrible things happening to me? Yet I nonetheless still preserve my life. There's almost a kind of faith involved in that. Kant says at that moment, one might be able to speak of one's actions having a kind of moral worth because one sees it as one's obligation to preserve one's existence, right? If you want to look at debates around euthanasia, for example, Kant would probably be quite relevant here. I think Kant would probably be opposed to euthanasia, mainly because he thinks one should preserve one's life in all situations and that euthanasia is the easy way out. However, perhaps there are some situations where one is unable to carry out any kind of moral action any longer, any kind of ethical existence, and so then one takes the euthanasia path. It might be an option for Kant. I don't really know. These are often questions that require a lot of consideration, things like that. Okay, but we haven't quite got to the rational part. All Kant is here establishes what it means to act in accordance with duty. Okay, now he's going to look at the next example is helping other people. He says to help others where one can is a duty. And besides this, there are many people of so sympathetic a temper that without any further motive of vanity or self-interest, they can find an inner pleasure in spreading happiness around them and can take delight in the contentment of others as this is their own work. Yet, I maintain that in such a case, an action of this kind, however right and however amicable it might be, has still no inherent moral worth. So what Kant is talking about here is the kind of person who is a nice person. They're very giving. Maybe they give a portion of their income to charity. They're always ready to volunteer for everything. They help their neighbor. However, and this is the important point, their actions are motivated by the feeling of pleasure and contentment that it gives them. And they may have some sense of, well, it's good to do this. I'm doing all this for my community. I'm benefiting my fellow human being. But Kant says that he maintains that unless there's a purely rational motivation, there's no consideration of one's contentment, the actions, however great it may be, and Kant doesn't oppose this. He says if helping other people and doing good in your community makes you happy, you should do it because you're acting in accordance with duty, because indeed Kant thinks helping others is indeed your duty. However, it has no moral worth. Okay, now I want to take a brief aside here and make a point. What is moral worth then? Why does it matter to act morally? But that is a good question. I think Kant, although Kant was religious on some level, he did believe in God. He believed that there was an afterlife. It may very well be that for Kant you should act morally because you'll be judged in the afterlife, and this is why you should act in accordance with duty. That may very well have played into it, but there's also evidence Kant had a more kind of atheistic approach to these matters. One can look in texts such as Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone and find a more atheistic kind of Kant, where Kant may have believed in some divine being in a kind of deistic sense, where he believes in God, but not in any kind of, he's not Christian or any other type of religion. But so if there's no religious justification for acting morally, for acting in accordance with reason, why should I do it? Why can't I just act then in order to try to make other people feel good and make myself feel good? Well, Kant thinks we have reason, and reason is what defines a human being, and you can only truly be most human when you act in accordance with reason. So there could be a kind of humanistic argument, an understanding of human beings, and a notion of humanity, and on the basis of that, we can then advocate for some kind of universalist type of morality. Okay, that's just an issue I wanted to raise for you. So the question I asked is, why act morally in the Kantian sense? Like, why isn't it that someone who is living more or less what we would probably say is a good life, why do you need to act morally? Well, it's a good question. Some people might, address that question further. I want to read more. Kant says it stands on the same footing as other inclinations. For example, the inclination for honor, which, if fortunate enough to hit on something beneficial and right and consequently honorable, deserves praise and encouragement, but not esteem, for its maxim lacks moral content, namely the performance of such actions not from inclination, but from duty. Okay, I want to answer my question, actually, the one I just raised, why act morally? That passage very much clarifies it. I forgot about that. So in the previous section, Kant talked about the goodwill, and you need to cultivate a goodwill, because otherwise you could act, but you could act virtuously, but your virtuous actions might have some sinister kind of motivation. And I think what Kant would say here is, it might very well be that the person who is helping their fellow human being, or giving their income away to people, they're giving their time to help others, this itself could become a kind of obsession where they neglect their own well-being, and it could also result in something negative. Maybe they, because they're not really doing it out of any kind of principles, they're just doing it because it makes them feel good. It could be that they get attached a little bit to the feeling of self-righteousness that they get, and this itself could be harmful. And it again says the same thing about courage. So that is, I think, why Kant wants us to act in accordance with duty, is because if we're not acting solely from rational principles, then it is very likely that our actions could become harmful. What is good could turn into its opposite and become negative. So that's where I think Kant is trying to go with this. If you're wondering, it's not all just words. When Kant says that person who's acting and trying to spread happiness doesn't have any moral worth, he means because that there's not a strong foundation for their action. It's kind of like building a house without a strong foundation. At a certain place, the house could crumble. I think Kant is very much a foundationalist in this sense. He wants to give you a strong basis for acting morally. Kant then says, suppose then that the mind of this friend of man were overclouded by sorrows of his own, which extinguished all sympathy with the fate of others, but that he still had power to help those in distress, though no longer stirred by the need of others, because sufficiently occupied with his own. And suppose that when no longer moved by any inclination, he tears himself out of this deathly insensibility and does the action without any inclination for the sake of duty alone. Then, for the first time, his action has genuine moral worth. I really kind of like this passage. I think it's quite commendable. So this is a person who's this good individual, outstanding member of their community. Everyone probably likes them. They probably have few enemies. But they're acting because, for the most part, they've acted because it made them feel good. Now, take that same person, but imagine that their actions are being done solely from the basis of reason, from rational principles. And suppose that a horrible thing happens in their life. No longer do they have their job. Maybe they lost their job because there was a massive layoff. Maybe they got ill. They lost a family member. But still, even though they're miserable, they're unhappy, they do this duty to others. They continue to help other people simply because they think this is what must be done. Not because it gets them out of their misery, not because it makes them think, less about themselves and their own unhappiness, but because it's their duty to do so, because they feel they have a certain obligation that love your fellow man is a moral principle. Then and only then can Kant say that this person's actions truly has moral worth. So can you think of any people like that? You probably can. I mean, there's loads of historical figures that had this kind of deep kind of desire to help the other, even in the face of absolute adversity. There's all sorts of literary figures, people in films. Actually, an example you might think about is, there's this Netflix show that I watched recently. I'm sure many of you have seen it, Squid Game, which very much does contrapose two people. I forgot their names. It was quite a while ago since I saw it. But basically, the show is about a group of people who are all in debt, and they get offered to play this game for which they'll win lots of money, and which will allow them to live a more kind of exciting life. It's set in South Korea, and they're drugged and blindfolded and taken to this island, and then they have to play these games. Little do they know that the games result, if you fail the game, you usually die. So in the first game, they have to run along a field, and if the big doll sees them, then they get killed, basically. And only the winners live. Now, the main character of the film, his principle is to try to save other people, not to win for himself, but to try to save other people. There's not really anything in it for him, because at the end of the day, the more people that lose, the more money you'll make in the game. That's how it works. And yet he has this kind of moral inclination to try to save others. Whereas the other character, who in the no spoilers, but later part of this show I'll get into a big conflict. I won't tell you exactly what happens. The other character, and there's a number of these, are all essentially trying to compete, often use violence, and eliminate their opponents in order to get the most money. The narrative of the show kind of proceeds in this exact way. And it's an interesting thing, because you have people here in a truly desperate situation, and in this kind of abstract kind of space, it kind of tests how they will act and respond to respond morally. Okay, so that maybe gives you a little sense of what's going on here. Okay, more from Kant. Still further, if nature had implanted little sympathy in this or that man's heart, if he were cold, intemperate, and indifferent to the sufferings of others, perhaps because being endowed with the special gift of patience and robust endurance in his own suffering, he assumed the like in others or even demanded it. If such a man were not exactly fashioned by her to be a philanthropist, would he not still find in himself a source from which he might draw a worth far higher than any of that good-natured temperament can have? Surely he would. It is precisely in this that the worth of character begins to show, a moral worth, and beyond all comparison, the highest, namely, that he does good not from inclination but from duty. This might even be a person who, doesn't particularly like people, or maybe is pessimistic, but still, because they think it's their duty to contribute to the collective welfare of humanity, participate in whatever way they can to try to make the world a better place. And they may have people might have different views of how they think they can do that. For some people, it might be an individual engagement with the world. For others, it might be political. For others, it might be artistic. But the main point is that it effectively is this disposition of acting on the basis of obligation. Okay, so now I want to kind of continue here. So Kant says, I'm going to skip a little bit here. Kant says, here's his proposition. An action done from duty has its moral worth, not in the purpose to be attained by it, but in the maxim in accordance which it is decided upon. It depends, therefore, not on the realization of the object of the action, but solely on the principle of volition, in accordance with which, irrespective of all objects of the faculty of desire, the action has been performed. So Kant says the moral worth an action gets doesn't result from the outcome in any way, but solely the principle with which it's decided on. Now, in the next chapter, Kant is actually going to say, well, how can I know whether a principle is itself moral or not? That's actually a separate question. Kant is not going to be saying that, for example, if your principle is you're using violence to achieve certain means, and well, that's my principle. I think I'm acting out of a principled way. It doesn't really matter what the goal is. Violence is, I mean, that's not what Kant is saying, actually. Kant is simply saying that the particular moral worth, certain actions, not all actions arises from the principles with which it's decided on. So that's the first major principle that Kant thus concludes. So this isn't the idea that the means justify the end. It's also not the idea that the ends justify the means. So there's not really a means ends. There's rather a shift of focus here. Okay, so Kant then goes along. I'm going to skip a little bit of this. Duty is the necessity to act out of reverence for the law. For an object as the effect of my proposed action, I can have an inclination but never reverence. Precisely because it is merely the effect and not the activity of a will. Similarly, for inclination as such, whether my own or that of another, I can have reverence. I cannot have reverence. I can at most in the first case approve, and in the second case sometimes even love. That is regarded as favorable to my own advantage. Only something which is conjoined with my will, solely as a ground and never as an effect, something which does not serve my inclination, but outweighs it or at last leaves it entirely out of account in my choice, and therefore only bear law for its own sake, can be an object of reverence, and therewith a command. And the command in the sense is, you must do this because it is your obligation to do this. Kant says that to act morally, one has to act out of duty, one has to have a certain reverence for the law. Now, to have reverence for the law, Kant thinks acting out of inclination, where you act because it makes you happy, or you act because you think your actions will result in some positive outcome. I can approve of that act or disapprove of that act. I could think that the person who's joining the volunteer squad to go help a COVID response team is a very good person. I can agree with their action, but Kant says I can't have a certain reverence. I can't say, well, it's that person's duty to do that, and that's the thing. Because reverence for the law is something for Kant that is totally rational. It's governed by rational principles, and I can't revere something that isn't rational. That is the thing, because my will, my subjective intention, is united with the objective necessity of the law. So he says, thus the moral worth of an action does not depend on the results expected from it, and so does not depend on any principle of action that needs to borrow its motive from this expected result. For all these results could have been brought about by other causes as well, and consequently their production did not require the will of a rational being, in which, however, the highest and unconditioned good can alone be found. Therefore, nothing but the idea of the law itself, which admittedly is present only in rational beings, can constitute that preeminent good which we can call moral, a good which is already present in the person acting on this idea and has not to be awaited merely from the results. Okay, I think that sums it up. So he says that moral worth doesn't depend on the results expected from it. If I act good, regardless of what happens, it doesn't matter to Kant. But also not the principles. I might have a principle of self-righteousness. Think, if I do this, I'm going to be a good person, I'm going to contribute to the world. So that's neither the objective results nor the subjective attentions. It's rather rational principles. And rational principles for Kant involve the negation of any kind of emotional involvement. On some level, right? I want to emphasize something. Kant's going to say that a person who lives by reason and acts rationally out of duty and reverence for the law isn't necessarily going to be unhappy. They might be unhappy at times. They may be very stressed. But it could more likely be the case that they're very passionate. They're probably committed to some kind of cause. And it's ultimately that cause, not so much just the ultimate goal of that cause, but the principles behind it. There's a certain rationality to this that's governing everything. Okay, so now Kant introduces the notion that he's well known for, the notion of the categorical imperative. Kant says, but what kind of law can this be, the thought of which, even without regard to the results expected from it, has to determine the will if this is to be called good absolutely and without qualification? Since I have robbed the will of every inducement that might arise for it as a consequence of obeying any particular law, nothing is left but the conformity of actions to universal law as such, and this alone must serve the will as its principle. That is to say, I ought never to act except in a way that I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law. This is really getting into the heart of Kant. So I've robbed every inducement that might prevent me from acting in accordance with the law. This universal law is the categorical imperative. And I can recite it here. Act in such a way that my maxim should become a universal law. So what Kant is getting at here is that I should act in a way that my act can become a universal standard by which every act could be governed. Essentially, if you really want to simplify it, what Kant is going to say is, if my action would be morally justifiable in every situation that one can possibly imagine, then it is indeed a moral principle that one can follow and that one can use to make decisions. Right? So if help your fellow human being, if there's no situation imaginable in which this would be irrelevant, or then this can be, this is for Kant a categorical action that can serve as a moral principle. And then, if I'm faced with the COVID response situation, I just simply jump into it. I don't need to think about, well, why am I what's it gonna result? It may very well be that my individual participation is disastrous, because, I was trained as a philosopher. I'm not a medical person. I don't know much about that. I'm an intellectual. I tend to think about things, so I don't necessarily have the best, skills when it comes to these kind of things, medical type of stuff. So, but if my principle is you should help other people in all situations, then the point is simply any situation I'm faced with, I simply jump into it because the moral principle tells me I have to do it. There's no longer a question. It may be that I have all sorts of appointments, but I put those appointments aside simply in order to do what I must do, my duty. Duty commands it. It acts as a command. So that is the first formulation of the categorical imperative. Always act in such a way that it can be formulated as a universal law. And he says, here, bare conformity to moral universal law such as what serves the will as its principle. So my will, and will here is your subjectivity, your freedom of choice to decide whether or not you're going to act in accordance with necessity. Your will unites itself with an objective principle. Your will unites itself with an objective law. The law is what's objective. I want to emphasize here, Kant is not talking in any religious sense. Essentially what Kant believed, I'm sure Kant had a biblical text in his house and read the Bible like anyone else in the 18th century would have. His view is actually every one of the 10 commandments, that were given to Moses on Mount Sinai in the story. God gives Moses the 10 commandments on the tablets, and then he comes down. He says you don't even need to believe in God for this. All you need is to use your principle of reason, and you can come to know that those 10 commandments are rational, they're justifiable. So Kant says, take this question, for example. May I not, when I am hard pressed, make a promise with the intention of not keeping it? So can I essentially promise something and not keep my promise? This is the moral dilemma. I promised to pay back my friend who loaned me some money, but then I lose my job and I don't have the ability. Kant would probably say, I'm going to read the example in a minute, he would say you better do everything and anything you can to find a way to pay back the money, even if it means accepting more hardship. Kant says, here I readily distinguish the two senses which the question can have. Is it prudent or is it right to make a false promise? The first, no doubt, can often be the case. I do indeed see that it is not enough for me to extricate myself from present embarrassment by this subterfuge. I have to consider whether from this lie there may not subsequently accrue to me much more greater inconvenience than that from which I now escape. And also, since with all my supposed astuteness, to foresee the consequences is not so easy, that I can be sure that there is no chance, once confidence in me is lost, of this proving far more disadvantageous. Okay, I'm going to read along. He says, yet it becomes clear to me that at once such a maxim is always founded solely on the fear of consequences. To tell the truth for the sake of duty is something entirely different from doing it out of concern for inconvenient results. For in the first case, the concept of the action already contains in itself a law for me, while in the second case, I have first of all to look around elsewhere in order to see what effects may be bound up with it for me. So what Kant is getting at here, if I don't pay my friend back because I'm afraid of, if the consequences being more ill, then I'm not acting in accordance with reason, because there's a kind of means-ends dynamic going on here. Telling the truth, I have to tell the truth out of duty, is what he's going to get at. Okay, coming now to the conclusion. Says, I then become aware at once that I can indeed will to lie, but I can by no means will a universal law of lying. For by such a law there could properly be no promises at all, since it would be futile to profess a will for future actions to others who would not believe my profession, or who, if they did so over hastily, would pay me back in like a coin. And consequently, my maxim, as soon as it was made universal law, would be bound to annul itself. So what Kant is saying here is that lying can never be turned into a universal principle. Because basically Kant says, can you think of a situation in which it wouldn't make sense to lie? If you can think of such a situation, Kant says then you shouldn't lie. Because such a single situation makes the principle ununiversalizable, and therefore cannot serve as a rational principle which you follow in every particular situation. I mean, that's really all Kant is saying here. A lot of people make more out of this than is there, but Kant's basic principle is you should always act on the basis of universal principles that can be universalized, because the universal is what's necessary, what's objective, and what must be followed in every particular situation, irrespective of the circumstances. Okay, so I think I'm going to end it there, because I feel like it is becoming a bit redundant. The categorical imperative, thus, in Kant's philosophy is this imperative to do what one must, right? So in the next video, I'm going to discuss chapter 2, where Kant goes into more detail to develop the categorical imperative and how we have to think about this. I hope this video was helpful.